Now we have come to the end of our accounting cycle. So far we've analyzed transactions, journalized them in the journal, posted them in the ledger, and then completed the trial balance. Once we have our trial balance figures, we've got to take a closer look at some of them. A few of the accounts are going to need adjusting. We have used up supplies and insurance, our equipment has aged and needs to be depreciated, and as of the end of the period, we might owe our employees unpaid salaries and wages. We have to account for these unrecorded expenses by completing adjusting entries at the end of the period. Here's how those work. First, we'll examine our trial balance to locate the accounts that need adjusting before the financial statements are prepared. The first one we'll look at is the supplies account. Now, according to our trial balance, we purchased $490 in supplies during the period. We have our information down here that's telling us that we examined our supplies inventory at the end of the period on March 31st and found that we only actually have $165 in supplies left. So if we purchased $490 over the period and we've only got $165 left, that tells us that we've used up $325 in supplies. If you take $490 and subtract $165, you get $325. And that's what we're trying to do. We want to bring our supplies down to $165, and then we want to show in our supplies expense account that we've used up $325 in supplies. So to do that, we're going to credit the supplies account. Okay, so it has a $490 debit, and if we credit it for $325, it will bring us down to $165. Then we're going to debit supplies expense. Remember, if we credit anything, we have to have an offsetting debit. Okay, so that's our first adjusting entry. So some steps to remember is, number one, find the amount that got used up in the account. So in the case of these supplies, $325 got used up. That is the amount of our adjustment. The second thing is make sure that your debit goes to the expense account. So since we're talking about supplies, the debit goes to supplies expense. Okay, let's move on to insurance. It says that insurance that expired is $100. Remember, when we purchased our insurance policy, it was prepaid. $800 was prepaid in insurance. And of this $800, we have used up $100. So if I ask myself how much was used up, and it just tells us here $100 was used up, so I know that's going to be the amount of my adjustment. And then the second step is make sure I debit the expense account. And since we're dealing with the insurance expense will be my debit. Okay, so I'm going to credit prepaid insurance for the $100 that was used up. That'll leave us with only $700 prepaid. And then we're going to show here that we've used up that insurance by debiting this expense account. Okay, so let's move on to depreciation. Depreciation of lawn equipment is $200. Now, sometimes your depreciation amount will be given and sometimes you'll have to calculate it, but in this case it's given to us. So we know that our adjustment will be $200, and the second thing we know is that we have got to debit an expense account. So since we're dealing with depreciation, our debit will be to depreciation expense for $200. And then the credit goes to accumulated depreciation. Remember, that's our typical adjusting entry for depreciation. Debit, depreciation expense, credit, accumulated depreciation. We never want to credit the equipment account itself because we want it to stay on the books here at its historical cost, or what we paid for it. Okay, so let's get our credit in. Okay, so now we've got our depreciation adjustment taken care of. And last, we have wages. Now, sometimes our employees earn wages but haven't been paid by the end of the year or the end of the period. So as of the end of the period, we owe our employees $180. So March 31st might have been, say, on a Wednesday, and we're going to pay them on a Friday, but we owe them for Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, so we need to show what we owe. So once again, we're going to debit our expense account. This is wages, so we'll find wages expense and debit that account. And since we owe these wages, we're going to credit wages payable. So these are 4 adjustments typically made for a business at the end of the period. Next, we need to total our worksheet columns to make sure that debits equal credits. So debits totaled $805, and our credits also totaled $805. So we know we're in balance. Our worksheet helped us to create our adjustments, but it's really important that we journalize them in the journal and then post them to the general ledger to bring the general ledger accounts up to date. Over in our journal, on the top line in the description column, we want to list adjusting entries. So when someone looks at our journal, they will know that the entries that follow are adjustments, and we won't have to put an explanation after each one of our entries. Just like any journal entry, we're going to start out by entering the date. So journal entries for the adjustments are done at the end of the period, so these will be dated March 31st. Now, the first adjustment we did was the supplies adjustment. We debited supplies expense and credited supplies for $325. So in the debit position, we'll enter supplies expense, and for the credit, we'll enter supplies. Next is insurance. For insurance, we debited insurance expense and credited prepaid insurance. That was for $100. The next entry was for depreciation. So we will debit depreciation expense for the $200, and then we'll credit accumulated depreciation for $200. And then our last entry was wages. We debited wages expense, credited wages payable. So now that we've got our adjusting entries journalized, it's really important that they be posted over to the general ledger, because our general ledger accounts are sitting there with outdated balances, and we need to post these adjustments in order to bring those balances up to date.